Senator Barbara L'Italian from Andover. I'm running for the 3rd Congressional District because I believe that now more than ever, this district deserves someone who has a broad range of experience in legislating, in working with constituents and solving problems, and who is a leader. And over the last 15 years, I've served in the House, in the Senate, and also with State Treasurer Steve Grossman. What I bring is a passion for people, caring about people's lives, helping solve problems, finding ways to make it better for your quality of life. I care very deeply about education, our environment, public safety, and economic opportunity for people. And so I'm hoping that as I'm out on the campaign trail, I can meet you all, talk with you, hear your suggestions, and use all of that knowledge to be an effective leader as the next Congresswoman from the 3rd Congressional District. Thank you so much. 9-year-old child at home, the youngest of my 4, and would not do that to my children at that age. And so I'm immediately thinking Jamie, Eileen, thinking of the folks that ran. I figured Maselli would not. But I thought purely plausible that Jamie and Eileen may run, And so I thought about it, and, Barry Feindl thought might be in the race as well. So immediately I was interested, but really took my time in officially jumping in and deciding, because it's a very serious job. I think it requires very serious consideration. You have to think about all the variables involved in getting elected, and that means staffing up with a combination of Massachusetts and Washington-based people. You have to think very seriously about what it costs to run these days. I mean, I guess in August when I first heard, I thought, oh, Barry raised $1 million. $1 million will probably be sufficient. And then people were looking at me like I had 2 heads and said, no, like $2 million is going to be the floor probably. So that's very daunting because I was someone that never really raised a ton of money and never took joy in doing that aspect of the job. And of course, doing this means stepping aside from the Senate seat. This is not a special. This is not, you're actually having to put something up and forego something. So I really took my time and really listened to a lot of folks, including, but not limited to, Nikki Songus and Catherine Clark, both of whom have been through this, and came to the conclusion that looking at the field, which changed a whole lot from what I anticipated, I spoke with Barry, and Barry was basically like, if you run, I can't run, basically, because I'm the senator, I have a base that he no longer has. And then Eileen, I'd heard inclinations that she was not, but she needed to make that decision on her timetable. And Jamie had announced that he was, I think he was the first to announce he was not going to run at that group.
He was out pretty quick.
He was, yeah, he called me right before he made it public and said that he was not going to run. So, the sands had shifted for a brief period. We thought Marty Evian's ex-wife was going to be in the race, and then she wasn't. So there's been a lot of, revolving chairs around who would like to run. But then as I looked at the race as it began to take shape, I really believe I am the person with the relevant experience in this race. I am the person who's been legislating, in the House and in the Senate, over the last 15 years. And so I really thought that I am the one that is uniquely qualified to do the job. I think it's a very serious job. I think there's a lot of people that would like to have the job but don't necessarily understand what it entails. I get what it entails. I've been, representing a very diverse House and diverse Senate district. This is a very diverse congressional district. There may be pockets of progressive people. There are a lot of gateway cities, and I've represented Haverhill and Methuen in the past, and I currently represent Lawrence. There are a large number of gateway cities that dot Route 495 and go out along the Route 2 corridor as well. And I get that. I've represented people in gateway cities. There are certainly suburban communities as well, similar to my hometown of Andover. But there are a lot of communities like Drake as well. There are a lot of communities that are trying to
rebound in terms of family farming, sort of the back to farm movement. You know, some of them are rural, and a lot of them are trying to figure out, you know, how to keep their tax base low and how to bring in business and how to sort of take advantage of whatever city might be nearby them. So I feel like I get sort of that mix of urban, suburban, rural, some progressive areas and some, you know, very pragmatic, moderate to conservative sections in this district as well. This is not a Boston congressional seat.
Like Drake, yeah.
That's right, that's right. And Drake had voted for Trump, for Nikki, and for me last time out. Every single precinct voted for me. Why? Because when the Kinder Morgan pipeline was coming to town, and it was going to go through Jim Oganowski's backyard and infect rocks and all these historic family farms on Broadway, you know, I met with all those folks and I took what they wanted me to project at those FERC hearings because I had the benefit of getting up first to speak. You know, the average Joe that showed up waited an hour or two, put their name in, maybe got called to get up and speak. I was given a privilege by virtue of being an elected official of getting up at the beginning. And so I sat down with all of the groups in Drake and Tewksbury and in Andover and reflected what they wanted me to say to FERC and to the Energy Facilities Siting Board, which is state-run. So I think I've earned those votes in Drake. I may be a little more progressive than some of those folks, but I covered what they needed me to do, the things that were concerning them. And I think that that's an important allegory for this congressional seat, is that you need to cover the basics for people first and foremost. People are concerned about having a good education, having a decent job, having housing. You know, those are, I call them the bread and butter issues. And those aren't different in any community, right? How we achieve those may differ greatly, but every community wants that. You know, some communities desperately need transportation, right? You know, being sure we take care of our seniors. You know, these are all issues that I think every community cares about. How you get there may differ. Certainly, each of the 37 cities and towns are going to have their own specific issues that they're concerned about. And I plan to meet with every single city and town, you know, to outreach to all their elected officials. I've already met with most of the state house officials, the reps and the senators, meet with the different chambers of commerce. You know, just sort of systematically come out and be present and listen. Not tell others what they need or want, but listen to what they need and want.
Just before you go too far on that, I want to ask you about the timing of your announcement.
Sure.
I think you were one of the first sitting elected officials who said that they're interested in the race.
Right.
Because I did that story, and I think we had a statement from you like 2 hours later.
Yeah.
Saying they're interested. But then
right.
You were one of the last to actually jump in. Mm-hmm. So I was, because so much time elapsed between when you made that announcement, I was beginning to think, oh, she's just going to stay in the Senate. She's got a safe Senate seat there. Mm-hmm. Were you? Should we interpret that as being on the fence about whether you should get in or not? Or was it just really serious due diligence that happened to take a lot of time?
Yeah, I would say I was doing my due diligence. And I was also, quite frankly, engaged with conversations with Eileen. Yeah. I thought it would not make sense.
Yeah, you wouldn't have done
for both of us to jump in and both of us to step away from the Senate. And, you know, she took a long time to decide as well. So I would say really it was trying to fully understand all the variables that were involved in running for Congress.
If Barry had jumped in, would you have jumped in? It sounds like you might have been seeing what he does.
I think there's only so much room for so many candidates from a given community, so it would have given me pause.
Yeah, okay.
But I think that he was saying to me sort of up front that he knew if I went in, he most likely could not. Yeah, and I also think there's an issue for him where he's got a 6-year-old at home. Yeah. And so it's different. You know, I had a 4-year-old at home when I ran for the House. It was an open seat, newly redistricted after 2002. That was a different situation because I'm coming home every single night, and I had my mom living with me, and you know, my mom was part of the family unit that decided that I should pursue this, and so she was my support system as well as my husband. I think that's vastly different from going down to DC. And you know, I think in the case of Barry, probably because of having a young, he's got 3, but the youngest is quite young. My youngest is now, well, when Nikki announced she was leaving, he was 19, he's now 20. So he's a student here at Middlesex, and you know, he's well on his way. So it's a difference in it. I think timing can be everything too.
Senator, you make a good point. I think unless anybody has jumped into this race overnight, there's only 3 people who've run for elective office in this race. There's Ryan, the Westford person,
School committee guy.
The representative Matthias, is that how you pronounce it?
Matthias.
Matthias,
correct.
I mean, no one's ever run in an election before.
Right.
Is that surprising to you, that the balance of all these people are well, they may be political, but they've never run in an election before? Is that?
Yeah, I mean,
It seems to be
I see a couple of reasons for that.
no celebrities yet.
Yeah, well, what about the ambassador to Denmark? He might fashion himself a celebrity.
Yeah.
He has a lot of YouTube.
I spoke to him
Well,
on-
check him out on YouTube, he's got quite a few.
Yeah.
I think it's attributable to a couple of things. I think the election of Donald Trump showed that you don't necessarily have to be an elected official to run for office. So that's number one. And conversely, I think for some folks there's a Trump effect. You know, there was the Women's March in January, and a lot of people deciding that they're outraged at Trump, and therefore they feel they need to step up and do something about it. So I see the election of the president affecting this in 2 very different ways. You know, to my thinking, I still believe that it's a very serious job. It requires someone who has come up through the system and knows the ropes and understands the delicate balance that happens, again, between district diversity, understanding when to listen and when to lead, and you know, you learn that the hard way, right? There are times when you want to jump the gun on something and then you realize maybe not such a good idea. But I think learning sort of that delicate balance, understanding how to legislate, understanding how to build coalitions with your colleagues, understanding how to work closely with the grassroots, with your constituents. Like last night I went to Drake to speak to a group of Cub Scouts. There were 2 Cub Scouts there, okay? But for those 2 Cub Scouts, I gave them the same presentation as if the room were full, because they asked me to come. They're earning their badge on civics, and it's my job to go out and talk to them, answer their questions and whatever. Because in my mind, the jobs I've done, you know, in the House and the Senate break down 3 ways. There's sort of the interface with the business community, with the elderly, with you know, with school groups and with everyday constituents, right? And last week we had a person in Tewksbury who needed oil in their tank. They had no heat, no oil. We had to help them. Last week we had someone that was on unemployment. They couldn't get anyone to answer the phones on unemployment, and they went to the office and no one was answering the door. So, you know, to me that's one leg of the stool, right, is all the interface, constituent services, all of that stuff. The second phase for me thus far has been working on legislation, you know, policy issues, all of that kind of stuff. And then the third has been sort of the allocation of resources through budgets, supplemental budgets, and whatever. So I already know all of that stuff. I already know how all that works. I have no illusions that it won't be different down in Washington, but I know enough to know what I don't know. And I think that regardless of who wins the, you know, whether the House swings Democrat or not after this election, job number one for whoever wins that race is to go down to Washington, establish the constituent services so they don't fall off, because I feel like Nikki's office does a wonderful job of that. And then you really set to work learning the written and unwritten rules of Congress, and beginning to get to know your colleagues by geography, by your committee assignment, by the building you're in, by where you sit on the floor. And, you know, I know how to do that stuff. And when I was in the House, you know, my district was a swing district that had a lot of Republicans in it and a lot of unenrolled. And a lot of the issues that I worked on weren't necessarily Democratic issues. They were issues that my district needed. So if Boxford was having their wells contaminated by the salting of Route 95, you know, I was working on that with 2 Republicans, Brad Hill and Bruce Tarr. And so to me, regardless of who's in power in the House, it's going to be incumbent on me to work with everybody and to cross the aisle and to work together.
Have you had any discussions with Congressman Moulton at all? Because it appears that the Democrats internally are trying to change their own party.
Right.
I mean, there's been this talk about, you know, the party being too old, too rigid, too status quo.
Right.
And Moulton himself is with a bunch of mavericks that are trying to get people elected all over the country who you know, think differently and
support a different person for speaker too.
Yeah, and it costs, so how do you figure in this thing? Because you talk about the Trump effect, and that's pretty interesting that Drake, you know, voted for you and Nikki and also Trump. So you're definitely on the radar with those people. Yet across the district we see Tran. He beat you know, a popular city councilor out there who brought in all the heavyweights, from Elizabeth Warren to Nikki Tsongas and everybody else. So
I think in that district, though, the interesting dynamic was there were 3 women on the ballot, right? There were 2 city councilors, and Claire Frieda, I think, got about 1,500 votes, and it was a 600 vote margin between Dean and Sue. So that was a unique scenario, I think, where perhaps the 4th candidate, the Green Party person, didn't register very high, but Claire, by virtue of having been a city councilor as well, took a fair amount of votes. So, you know, I will say that, yeah.
The question about the Democratic Party itself, I mean, how are you going to position yourself? I mean, in primaries, usually the activists come out and vote. You know, the real, you know, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but those, you know, in this climate, I mean, the way you're looking at the landscape,
right?
What are you going to do? How are you presenting yourself? How you?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about bipartisanship, but we hear that from everybody who comes in here.
Yeah, but I've done it. I guess the difference is I've done it. You know, people. This is going to be the debates are going to be highly theoretical for most of the candidates. You know, am interested in this. I'm going to endorse that. I want to do this. I've got a record. I've already done a whole bunch of stuff. So that's the difference, I would say, in terms of, you know, as I outlined, representing in my House district, working on special ed issues, working on some of the environmental issues in Boxford. Yeah, I worked with my Republican colleagues. I've got a record that shows that I've done that. In terms of this district, again, it's not Boston. It's not Catherine Clark's district. You know, it's not Capuano's district. It's not Steve Lynch's district. It is a district that I said has pockets of progressivity, right? And I would put that as being in the greater Concord, Acton, Boxborough, Sudbury area, right? Pretty progressive folks. And
Rufus country.
Well, that's where he lives. That's where he bought himself a house, yes.
Oh, there we go.
But, you know, I think I am an interesting mixture, okay? And it's probably reflective in my parents, but I'm an interesting mixture. I am a progressive person. I'm not afraid to say I'm progressive, but I'm pragmatic about it, right? So I was one of the first people in my freshman year in the House to stand up and support equal marriage. And I didn't have anyone in my family that was directly affected. I took my lumps from my Catholic Church over it, but I thought it was the right thing to do. And so I'm not afraid to be progressive. I'm not afraid to stand up and defend progressive values. But I think you can do that after you've covered what I was talking about earlier, sort of those bread and butter issues of economic security, housing, education. So
you also jumped out the front on Stanley Rosenberg.
I did. And I
take any heat over that?
I took a little heat in the caucus, in the closed caucus, that long day when we all sat down and talked about it. There were people who were very unhappy with me. I'd say that was fewer than 5. There were people that were absolutely relieved that I'd opened up the door and talked about the fact that how can you have a independent investigation with the speaker still on the job, doing all of the duties of this, I'm sorry, Senate President, all the duties other than the investigation. It would put a real chilling effect on the victims.
Was anyone else going to make that call?
I don't don't know. I don't know.
Okay, so some.
And then he actually tendered that. You know, I had no idea that Monday that I called for it on Friday after the press conference where it was sort of nothing tangible was said. And then,
the one that lasts about a minute?
Yeah, and I do attribute that to he was caught off guard, and I think he had no idea, and he was just struggling.
Would you have made that call if you weren't a candidate for Congress?
I think I would have. Okay. I think I would have. You know, I'm a social worker. That's my background.
Yeah.
I've dealt with victims over my professional career, and you know, I was really caught off guard by what was written in the Globe and the very physical accounts of what was going on, and that just hit me in the gut. And I think I was focused on the victims, so the victims and the institution of the Senate. You know, in my opinion, those are the two things that are most important here. Not the person, not any one person. You know, I like Stan. I think he's done a wonderful job, but I think his ability to govern has been diminished quite a bit. You know, I particularly after sort of the 1-2 Brian punch, I call it, of Brian Hefner, his husband, earlier in the week, and then at the end of the week, former Senator Brian Joyce. Now more than ever, you need to have someone that's absolutely above, you know, reproach, you know, above the appearance of impropriety, whether that happened or not. So I still feel that he really cannot come back as Senate President. There are those who think that he can. I don't see that happening. For the sake of the institution has to continue. So, you know, my first vote I ever cast was for Speaker back in 2003, so 15 years ago right now. And Tom Finneran called me to see if I'd vote for him, and I had to politely say I will not be voting for you, I'm sorry, but as I went around my district, you know, the feedback I got suggested that people did not want me to vote for you. I mean, it's the toughest thing in the world to say to someone, you've never met him yet, and you know, you hear he rolls with an iron thumb, and
did he carve up your district?
Well, what became my district was Carol Cleven's district.
Right. Yeah.
They took it away from her because she was a woman without a country, right?
Yeah.
And so they brought it up into my part of the Merrimack Valley, and hence the 6 communities, bits and pieces of every one of them, not the majority of anything. A lot of people looked at this and said, I'll pass, I'm not going to run for that seat. But not knowing what I didn't know, I'm like, I'll run. So anyways, I've not been afraid to step out and step up and take my lumps. I mean, I see these jobs as a privilege. I don't see them as something that you have forever. And I'm not someone who wants to sit back and just protect my seat and be there in perpetuity. I want to see what difference I can make. You know, the stuff that I focused on was really from my experience as a mom with my son with autism, and my frustration in not being able to help him with his public school system, and with his health insurance coverage, and with a whole host of things. And I just went in and started systematically making changes, not just, for my son, but for so many others in the state. And that's what motivated me to run, and that's what I did. I went in and, within the first month, I was sitting down with the heads of the state agencies saying, this is what's going on now, how can we make this better? And we have.
So I want to go back to your pragmatic side.
Sure.
You're in that meeting yesterday with Donald Trump, okay, discussing the DACA issue.
Right.
Okay, and he says, hey, give me my wall, I'll give you anything you want. On DACA, there's 800,000 people that you care so much about. Mm-hmm. I want $18 billion for my wall. Now, we've wasted money. $18 billion. We're probably wasting it right now every second in government. I'm not saying the wall is a waste.
Right.
But do you take that deal, or do you do like the old arm of the Democratic Party, which was in that room, as I said, oh wait, give us the DACA first, and then we'll talk about immigration reform. Mm-hmm. Or do you say, gee, if we really care about these 800,000 people, okay, mm-hmm. A lot of them were born here, they work, families and stuff. What's wrong with the compromise? Why not give him his $18 billion?
Yeah, I think they're concerned that they thought they had a couple of other deals with him in the past and those vanished. So I think that's probably the concern, right? So I have no problem negotiating with people in good faith. But, you know, if you make a deal, you have to hold by the deal. You can't promise one thing and then change your mind and tweet something entirely different, you know, a few hours later.
He didn't tweet for 1 hour.
So that's the concern.
But if we were at that table though, right, we should talk about some issues,
right.
federal issues. Do you think that that was a fair trade?
Yeah, I mean, I think, personally, I'm opposed to the wall. I think it's an exorbitant price. Yeah. I think that the concern that he really has isn't based as much on people coming over the border as it is a concern around probably terrorism, right? And there's homegrown terrorism going on all over the world as well. So I am not in favor of the wall and what it represents. But, you know, I do understand that being involved in politics is making a deal.
So would that have been a deal that you would support?
Well, I think I would want to support those young people. I would want to support DACA, yeah.
If it meant building a wall?
Again, I find the wall incredibly...
You said that.
We
get that.
Yeah.
But he asked a good question.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Talk about these issues.
Listen, absolutely, you know, so much of this job is not theory. It's sitting down and banging out a decision and coming up with the best that you possibly can. And a lot of this is incremental as well. People don't understand that the people that get elected and think they're going to change the world on day one, oftentimes leave office very disenchanted.
Right, so let's try.
Okay, so
Can I jump in?
Hold on.
No, this, I mean, we're going to do this all the candidates, but I just find it odd. The whole world was there to see. Okay, and here's this guy who's been calling from crazy to unfit. He was like any normal, if not, he was the boss, and he was involving everybody, functioning with everybody. And it seems like he's showing the hypocrisies of Washington with everything he does, whether he does it the right way or not. And all those politicians are around the table, and he said, tell me, what do you want? You're the people, I want you to make the decision. Come up with it and I'll sign it. I want the wall for security reasons. He says, and you get to write immigration reform. Now, Seth Moulton is making the same point because the Democrats are waiting until after the 2018 elections. We don't even have an ambassador to Germany, a major ally. They've been holding up this guy that everybody agrees is a great guy. 1 year, because they're waiting till after 2018, the big and power, they get the chance now to set the tone, to make a deal, save their people, even if it means they can sign up all 800,000 in the Democratic Party. The president's saying, okay, you want it? Let's do it. And yet Marty Mean used to tell me, you know, sometimes you used to have to hold your nose and vote just to get what you wanted eventually. There used to be compromise, the art of compromise. What is so bad about a wall? Like you said, you know, it's actually going down. People trying to get into the country now. I mean, it's not even a problem. So
yeah, I would say,
I just don't understand it.
I would say that, you know, I do think that we need to preserve those young people. I think they are one of the reasons why our population is growing is because of immigrants and, you know, their families, and in this case most of these kids were brought here as young people. You know, I do think that we need to do more compromise and we need to make more deals. My fear in making that deal, okay, so let's say a tentative yes, because my concern would be if you say yes to him and then he keeps shifting the goal, you know, changing the goalposts.
Which has happened, right?
Exactly, and that's happened with a couple of the things that they've talked about. So I think that would be my cause.
That's a fair answer. Yeah. What about the whole issue of making Jerusalem the capital?
Yeah, that's a really complex one. I'm already talking with people.
Andover has a very large Jewish population too.
They do. Yeah, I'm already talking with people that are all over the map on the issue of Israel and the issue of the Palestinians. You know, I've been there twice. I went as a House member and as a Senate member. I think that I went with the Jewish Community Relations Council, And they said at the outset, you'll leave here, if we've done our job properly, you'll leave here with more questions than answers. And I do believe that was true. When you begin to look at how many parties are involved in their parliament, when you look at all the different tribes within Israel, people here don't realize that you can be a non-observant Jew, you can be a Reform Jew, you can be a conservative, an ultra-conservative, an Orthodox. You know, there's all these different groups, and they organize themselves by their religious belief, right? So there's a lot of tribes, again, a lot of siloing that goes on. You know, I think there are those who don't believe there should be a two-state solution. Most people believe there should, but how you get there, where are the borders going to be drawn? Are they going to stop with the creation of more developments in, you know, over in that area? I've had already very impassioned people. I had someone offer for me to go to Palestine last week and stay for a week, and I said there was no way I could do that. Right now, by the way, you know, because of Trump's decision, I think that it's become a very dangerous place.
So do you support that decision?
I don't. I think that I get the religious significance for the Jewish people to lay claim to Jerusalem, but I've also been there and seen that portions of it have been laid claim also by the Palestinians. So I think that it was, it upset a diplomatic apple cart, and I think that's been acknowledged by most of the other countries in the world. And so sometimes I think the president sort of going out on a limb and making these decisions, presumably to satisfy a particular electorate, without any sense of what the repercussions are. And I don't pretend to be an expert on international policy. That's something that I acknowledge that I need to learn a whole lot more about. But having visited both Palestine and Israel on 2 occasions, I just think that we need to be very, very mindful and very careful about the public proclamations that we make, because it just sets into motion a whole lot of discord that I'm not sure we're prepared to deal with. So I'm not an expert on international. I do not proclaim to be.
We have not, we don't have a solution yet.
Yeah.
Jim Kennedy doesn't?
Not yet, we don't have a solution. It's only been 20 years.
And so I have another question about fundraising.
Can Tom, let's get
Do you have a question?
Actually, I want to go back, Senator, to something you said earlier. You used the word theoretical
Sure.
to talk about the race and some of the issues. First is, how much difference really is there between you and the other 12 candidates on issues, not on experience, but on issues, okay? And secondly, how does somebody else break out on issues to make this, because you're talking 37 communities, 13 candidates, you've got your pocket, everybody's got their pocket. How do you win over the person that is going to check in 2 weeks before the election?
Right. That's a great question. I don't know the answer, how you check in to someone that decides, like, and by the way, the primary's the day after Labor Day. So there's not even a cushion from people coming back, although a lot of schools start in August now, so a lot of people are back earlier than when I was a kid. How do we differentiate? I think it will remain to be seen. I believe the first real issues forum I'm being made aware of might be down in Marlborough the first week in February. I read about it on Facebook. I have not been formally invited, but it's supposedly a 2-hour forum where they're going to have they're going to invite every candidate. They're going to ask every candidate the exact same question, and it's a 2-hour format. So that'll be interesting.
Where's that again, bro?
In Marlborough somewhere. I saw it on Facebook. So
Hopefully you get invited.
I think you'll see people have different answers to different things for sure. I don't have a sense yet of how much daylight there is between each of the candidates. I don't know. If other races are to be instructive, right? As you look back to the race from 10 years ago, there was certainly a left flank in Jamie Eldridge. I would say that then many of the other candidates were pretty close to the pack with each other. So my guess is that people might have slightly different takes on issues, but they won't be all that far apart from each other. I think the differentiator, in my opinion, for me, is my experience and having done this work and having legislated and having taken tough stands, and it won't be theoretical for me on many of these things. When people talk about healthcare, I'll talk about having voted for healthcare, whereas others will say what they think they'd like to do on healthcare or education or whatever. So I think that will be different. Certainly there are people that are carving out geographical bases, but there are areas that don't have a candidate. And I think it's at anyone's peril not to, to abandon parts of the district.
You're getting an apartment in Fitchburg at all, or?
Yeah, there is now a Marlboro candidate, and a Boxborough candidate, and a Lancaster candidate.
Right.
So we have a few down in that area.
Nothing if you start hitting up 119 is pretty.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
yeah, I mean, I look at it this way, right? I look at it that you do a great disservice if you don't pay attention to the whole district. And so you certainly want to invigorate and lock down your base if you can, and for me that's Methuen, Lawrence, Andover, Dracut, Haverhill. I've represented all of those communities at one time or another over the last 15 years. But I had a very interesting conversation with a very high-profile person in Lowell last week who said to me, there's no Lowell candidate in this race. There are two people who've moved to Westford, and he said if you've grown up in Lowell and someone's moved to Westford, they're not a Lowell candidate. And then there are the two other folks that are thinking of moving in, or one has to vie for Lowell. And this person, asked me, he said, I'm going to give you a list of everyone you should call in Lowell, and I want you to start showing up at things in Lowell.
The Dayton guy.
The Dayton guy, yeah. So what's on your radar? What are some of the things that drives you? You go to Congress that you might look across the aisle or work with people. It doesn't have to be way up here, but is there anything that you're thinking about right now that might be, you put your fingerprint on it?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think some of it will differ based on the needs of the communities in the Congressional District. The things that I have worked on and been quite successful on during my time in the legislature, worked on a lot of issues around folks who are reliant on state assistance, so they're disabled or they're elderly, trying to find better ways of providing services to folks that are going to need a lifetime of assistance if they're severely disabled, or towards the end of their life if they're elderly. Trying to find ways in which we can provide that out of institutions, in the community, being able to, in many instances, serve 4 people in the community to 1 person in a nursing home or other institutions. So it's not incredibly sexy work, but it appeals to me as a social worker to help people and provide a good quality of life for them. But it's also, as you look at our state budget, and I helped write the state budget for 2 years when I was in the House, our expenditures on Mass Health are a large portion of our budget. So re-engineering how we spend our dollars and leveraging federal monies wherever possible was my way of trying to slow the growth of the Mass Health program. So it made good sense financially, but also was really a humane thing to do for people. So a lot of the work that I did was really, much of it within autism, but also within intellectual and developmental disabilities work, and also with seniors as well. Right now I'm working on Alzheimer's, trying to find ways to make it easier for families, because in my mind, and having experienced this for the last 7 years with my mom, Alzheimer's and other illnesses can be a great equalizer. I don't care what job you have, I don't care what station you have in life. If you have a loved one, a parent, or a family member with Alzheimer's that all of a sudden requires a tremendous amount of care, if there's not a system in place to help you, you're missing work, you've got a lot of money out of pocket taking care of that person. So these are, I call them the quality of life issues that some people haven't had to experience because they've been extraordinarily fortunate. Having, raised 4 children, including one with autism, I had to confront this very early on in my marriage, right? And figure out how it's going to help my son be the best person he possibly could be.
And having worked at Elder Services Merrimack Valley, in fact, Lowell was my area when I was doing that work. I just know that, you know, many of us have aging parents. Our population is aging. How are we going to tackle these major policy issues and make sure that people have dignity, that they are cared for, that they are safe in a way that isn't going to break the bank? So that's a lot of the stuff I've done. It's not partisan at all, you know, and again, because it can affect anybody. Some of the other stuff I've worked on includes education, particularly special education, finding ways to better deliver services, because as you look at who fails our benchmark, right, which is the MCAS test, the two big subgroups are English language learners and folks with learning disabilities and special needs. So I haven't touched the ELL, someone else has done that. He's now the Ways and Means Chair, Jeff Sanchez in the House. But looking at special ed and how we can better and more directly address people's needs, the earlier the better. And I'll give you an example of dyslexia. So right now, within dyslexia, we have a lot of kids that the school systems won't diagnose and treat until they hit about 3rd or 4th grade. And by then, their gap with their peers is so large that it's almost insurmountable. And so I'm trying to address dyslexia, having a routine screening at kindergarten age, and then giving the kids the specialized learning that families who have money can go out and pay for privately, and others who can't, the kids just continue to get further and further behind. And then as we're trying to graduate these kids and have them pass MCAS, we're putting enormous amounts of money into remediation, when in fact we kind of created the problem by not addressing it, diagnosing it, and dealing with it as early as kindergarten. And so those are the kind of things that I work on, sort of policy issues on, you know, if so many kids are failing, how can we wind that back and figure out at what point we should be intervening, being proactive. The same with autism, with getting insurance coverage for kids for behaviors, because I was getting too many constituent calls from families whose kids were nonverbal or couldn't manage their behaviors when they were little. That was fine, and then they get to be as big or bigger than their parents, and then I get the call, find an institutional placement for my child. I can't, this doesn't work anymore. And I was like, well, we failed that family if that's where we're at. You know, how can we make it easier to get them the behavior therapy, the speech therapy that they need early to get the best possible outcome, rather than having these horrific problems that happen when we don't tune in and pay attention to what the needs are.
You know, the state's looking for an education commissioner.
I know, yeah. Yeah, so those are the things that I'm passionate about. You know, those are the things that motivate me to want to run for office. I do all sorts of other things as well, obviously. Economic development, and, you know, one of the committees that I chair has, you know, sort of all the new tech clash between new tech and the old guard of ways of doing business. And so Tesla, direct selling versus the car dealerships, and should we be rewriting the distribution of alcohol to allow for a burgeoning craft beer industry that's become an economic driver in places like Hudson, where Medusa Brewing is, versus the standard ABCC 70-year way of doing business. Are we going to change that?
Tax on it. That's funny.
Yeah, so I deal with all those things in my district, in my committee, and you know, a lot of it is sort of old business versus new. Are we going to allow the lottery to go online to compete with, you know, the fantasy gaming world? All that stuff comes before my committee. It's fascinating, and you know, there are a lot of decisions to be made, yeah.
If you go to Congress, I'd like you to look into, you know, they always have infrastructure money available to fix bridges and roads. I think new schools are infrastructure.
I agree.
Okay? And I think that the cost for building a new schools in Massachusetts are out of control.
Yeah.
And it's putting pressure on urban centers to tax their people and bankrupt the cities from other projects. Now, the more affluent communities, they can withstand this declining formula for reimbursement. But you're bankrupting, this new high school is going to bankrupt Lowell for 20 years. It's doing the same in Editorial and Suburban. And you know what, that would be worth looking at and changing, because if they really think that schools are necessary to improving society.
There really isn't a federal mechanism for funding
No,
schools. The MSBA, this is round 2. I remember the battle days of the first iteration of MSBA, where so much of it was political and very little of it had to do with formula and need and all of that. And so when that was redone and Catherine Craven was the original director, it was at least a fair process, right? But you're right, there are a lot of critical infrastructure needs that there's no federal funding mechanism for. We have a state funding mechanism for schools and libraries. I'm thinking of your library that had the water damage, right? But there's no real federal mechanism for that. There's no mechanism, state or federal, to build a senior center or a youth center or a all-purpose, all families recreation center. So all these critical infrastructure things, I believe, ought to have some sort of dedicated mechanism, still undergoing a fair process, and providing the funds based on need and all of that. But I know in my hometown there's been a lot of push and starts and fails around building a senior center. And Sue Tucker, my mentor and predecessor in the Senate, and was my colleague when I was in the House, was trying to do a bill to set up a system to allow for senior centers to be built. But you can name it to any major critical infrastructure piece, right? That communities just don't have the means to be able to fund. In Lawrence, they're in a police station from 1957. The nicest part of the whole thing is a trailer that's been backed up next to the building. We've had the governor come through, the Senate president, the speaker. Yeah. It's really bad, and there would be like 20 of the highest ranking officers in one little, a quarter of this room having to do their work. And it's just, so they're coming up with a really interesting idea, which is to try to work with Northern Essex, that's right behind them, and become a training facility, because there's not enough training slots open in the state for police training. So they'd like to combine Northern Essex's criminal justice program with a police training academy and have it be on-site and connect with, the Lawrence Police Building, and have the training be right there, and have it be almost like a Quantico for the Northeast, So, creative idea.
Well, this question comes to us from Chris Zazinski, one of our reporters that you've spoken to a couple of times. We appreciate that. You took Narrow to task for endorsing Steve Kerrigan. Now, we're not supposed to have opinions, but it seems to me that why would they be endorsing a guy when there are several women
He's
in
on
the
their
race?
national board.
So
he did not disclose the fact.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
But I was more interested in your comment about the church.
Yeah.
You said you were asked to leave your church.
Yeah, you haven't heard this? No one watched my roll-up video.
Videos on my computer downstairs.
In 2004, end of my freshman year, I was one of a small group of people that fought to uphold the SJC decision, the Goodrich decision on equal marriage. And I was targeted, seen as most likely to lose my seat by then Governor Romney, because I was in a very swing district. And I won re-election in 2004, and then the next day my new-to-town parish priest from Virginia called and wanted to come over and visit, and I thought, sure, why not? And ironically, my mom and dad had lived attended the parish that he was from when my dad worked for the FBI down in DC. And so I baked brownies, and we invited him in. He sat around my table with my mom and my husband and I, and after the pleasantries were exchanged, he explained that he was most unhappy that I was endorsed by Planned Parenthood, and that I had supported equal marriage, and I was hereby asked to step aside from all my duties at my church. So I had been a singer, a cantor at St. Augustine's Church. That predated running for office. I'd done it all through college at Merrimack as well, every Sunday, the 11 a.m. student mass. And I helped run the children's choir with 3 other parents, and 3 of my 4 children were involved in that. And I was asked to step aside from all of that by him. So that's what I'm referencing.
Is that the church near the railroad tracks?
Yes.
St. Vincent's?
Yeah. It created a real split within my church. A lot of people ended up going to St. Michael's in North Andover. I was the first, but I wasn't the last that this particular priest went after. He went after a number of CCD teachers and others, and then eventually the community asked that Archdiocese to remove him from the parish. But so I was a victim of the culture wars back in 2004. Yeah, so it...
So then you saw this.
Well, in my mind, I believe everyone has the right to choose their own personal health care decision. It's a very personal health care decision that people make. I have 4 children, but for others, you know, there are other considerations, health considerations, and so I've always been pro-choice. I think people have the right to make those decisions between the family unit and their doctor, but certainly not for us to be legislating. And so, yeah, I've always supported a woman's right to choose in the legislature. The local NARAL knows that, Planned Parenthood knows that. Steve is on the board at the national level. And so I'm sure that's why there was no process and why he got the endorsement. So.
Are endorsements that important to you anyway?
You know, it depends on the endorsement and what it carries, right? I think sometimes endorsements are overrated, particularly when it's among elected officials. You know, it's really not the endorsement that carries weight. It's who's their sphere of influence, who are their worker bees, you know, who's supported them. That's the more important piece you want to get to, right? The endorsement of someone per se isn't as important as really getting down to being able to reach out and meet people and all of that. You know, with some of these, they carry a financial contribution. With some of them, they will actually do a mailer for you. So in that regard, it's a tangible, you know, it carries a tangible amount of money, right? But, you know, this is the fact that there's no interview, no process, you know, is interesting.
What's funny, a lot of the candidates in this race have been making a great deal out of endorsements. You know, in our Sunday political column the last few weeks, we've had kind of a running list of endorsements. And
I think there's a time and place for endorsements, certainly as we transition out of that first quarter of raising money. You know, we are starting to make those calls and seek some endorsements as well. I think their impact can be overstated. I think oftentimes they're symbolic, more so than anything. But there's a place for them in the race. It is something that should be done. But with a national level endorsement, again, with no process, I mean, that's the disturbing part in my mind. So it is what it is. You know, you're not going to win them all, and that's just the truth of all of this. You know, it doesn't mean that you don't compete for everything that you think you have played a part in and are entitled for consideration, but the reality is you're not necessarily going to get them all. So.
Do you have any questions?
I just wanted a clarification on how you would handle that DACA deal.
Oh, okay.
I just
it's the quiet one that wants to close the deal.
I just need to get a more...
tentative approval is what you said.
Tentative approval, but understanding that the concern is that I think that this president has shown himself to agree to things, or people have left buildings under the impression that they have an agreement in hand, and then it's kind of backflowed. So, but I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a fan of the wall. I think that I don't think that that's going to solve the concern that he really has. I think he's looking at terrorism and being concerned about how we're going to, you know, control that issue. And when you see what's going on in Europe, you know, and we've seen it now in the United States, there are issues of homegrown terrorism. So I think the bigger concern is how do you address people that have kind of dropped out of the mainstream, feel they have no economic prospects, and then sort of resort to this extremism. I mean, I think that's part of the problem.
And I know we're going to wrap this up and stuff, but it seems in both parties, what's wrong with questioning your own party's leadership, whether it's the president or the minority leader? I mean, we saw this somewhat in that Tron election. I mean, he wasn't on board with Governor Baker on a couple of
social
issues.
issues, right.
And the Democrats made a big deal of it. I think they actually hurt Sue Shalfo in some respects, because, I mean, we don't agree all the time, but yet we try to start this dialogue. And it seems, you know, if you go to Washington, I mean, I think as if you're representing me, which I'm a constituent of yours, I want you to question some of these things, and you know, and maybe with things that need to reform. And I don't know your thoughts on that. I mean, when should a Democrat question their leadership? And even like you just questioned,
I've
something.
given you two examples.
Yes,
Yes,
that's right, with the Rosenberg thing and,
Yeah.
and ethics, and that plays a big role. And not just a grandstand, but to say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at our party platform. Let's, you know, why are we doing things like this? I mean, is that, are we lacking that today?
Yeah, I think that, you know, any good, thoughtful politician, underscore thoughtful, always has to be checking in with their constituency, always has to be reflecting on and be open to making changes when things don't go the way they should be going. I think that you have to have that openness and constant feedback to understand, just like passing legislation that has unintended consequences and they play out, and then you say, oh, that didn't work, we've got to reel that in and make that change. I think that, you know, you always have to be open to that feedback of how things are going and when changes need to be made. And again, you wanted examples. I've given you two concrete where after knocking on doors, you know, in my House district, and people really weren't happy with Speaker Finneran, I went in and my first vote was not voting for him.
Was that John Norwood? Was he running that?
Ron Rogers from Norwood.
John Rogers. Was he in the race that time? Was this?
No, this was '03, so it was the Rushing 17. Do you remember the Rushing 17, Byron Rushing?
Oh, Byron Rushing.
Yeah,
that's
Charlie
right.
Murphy from
Oh, yeah,
Burlington
okay.
was one
Yeah,
of those.
yeah.
I think Barry may have been too, I forget. But
Okay.
I didn't know Byron Rushing. He hadn't called me, he hadn't asked for my vote. So I voted present because I was not voting for Tom and didn't really know the other person. So I got a lovely basement office for 6 years.
Like
And
Stan's new office?
And I put my head down and I did my work and I got to know everybody and I got to know what motivated them and, you know, let them know what I was here to work on and establish myself as a leader on elder issues, disability issues. Got a lot of legislation passed and then, you know, became the vice chair of Ways and Means. So I rose up through the ranks and I think I earned their respect as a hard worker and someone that wasn't afraid to step up and do the work. So. I mean, that's what I think, you know, should happen to whoever goes down to Congress. Put your head down, learn the job, focus on the possibilities of what can be done, make sure there's no lapse in constituent services because people depend on that. And, you know, if you're the person calling me and you've not been able to get through on the unemployment line, you know, that's the most important thing in your life, right, is making sure you're going to get a paycheck. Or if you're the person calling me and you don't have fuel in your tank and don't know what to do and you've got kids at home that are cold, that's the most important thing in your life. You know, so you can't lose sight of constituent services too. I mean, I think that those are critically important things that need to continue to happen. They're happening now and happening well. They need to continue. But I think, you know, the person needs to go down there and be very pragmatic and work on issues and you know, have a vision for what can be and not just be satisfied with what is.
Very good. Anything else? No, sir. I want to thank you for coming in and
Sure.
sharing your thoughts with us.
My pleasure.
And very good. We'll see you again, hopefully.
Yeah,
But
very good.
we're planning to set up our own debates. We want to have, you know, Lowell area and then also Fitchburg area.
Maybe out Devon's way.
Yeah, so,
Just like the
so
last
we're planning that now, and we're hoping that by March, some, you know, there might be some change in the lineup.
Yeah.
You
A
know.
winnowing, we're gonna go under a
You might
dozen.
see a winnowing, honestly,
Yeah,
after
yeah,
at two
yeah.
pressure points. One is when people start reporting their money for the end of this year. I think you'll see some winnowing there. And I think you'll also see some winnowing when people realize what it takes to get 2,000 certified signatures, because you really get
Yes,
4,000.
that's due in March, right? Isn't that March?
No, it won't be due until end of
We
April,
had that
early
problem.
May.
Yeah,
It's a
April.
little
Yeah.
later than the state rep and state senate. It's a couple of weeks after. There's a little bit more time. But I think when people who've thrown their hat in realize how much groundwork it takes to get that many signatures,
That's not
I
easy,
think
is it?
that will most likely cause some people to say, I'm just not able to do this. I can't scale up on this thing. So I think you'll see it settle somewhere around 8 to 10 people is my guess.
Is the Jim Fiorentini, you think he's going to jump
I
in?
don't think he's going to.
No.
He's a very smart man.
And he just got sworn in.
Yeah, he
You know?
literally got sworn in last week. I was at his inauguration. He knows how the campaign piece of this, the finance piece goes. He would have had to have raised some money this quarter that just ended, I think, to be successful. And he didn't raise any. Yeah, he was putting a few people on the sidelines waiting. He was asking people to wait, but then he never pulled the trigger, so I don't believe he's trying to run. Yeah, and I represented Hazel for 8 years, and I lived there the first 7 years after I got married. I lived in a condo in Haverhill because I couldn't afford to buy a house in my hometown. So, I think him not running is a very good thing for me. Helps me a lot in Haverhill. Yeah.
Good.
So, yeah.
Who knows?